evening, chat. Impy. Mina. I hope that the audio mixing is fine today. If the background noise is too loud or too quiet, you just let me know. Tonight I'm going to try something very experimental, which is why I am on YouTube today. Yo. No model today, it looks like. I'm going to be enjoying this beautiful artwork that I commissioned from a nice artist. Link in the description. The background, though, I drew myself. I am quiet, you are right. I noticed that when I was doing a test recording. I realized this might be a little bit tricky. There's different ways to do this. I could either turn off the noise suppression, which is a terrible idea, or I could try to find a way to raise my gain volume somehow. I think I might be able to, actually. Open sound settings. Let's manage my sound devices. Why is the only option disable? Excuse me. Well, I was not anticipating this. Time to do some troubleshooting on stream. Very cool. How to raise mic volume, Windows 10. Oh, we're going to the control panel for this one. I haven't seen you in a while. Control panel, hardware and sound, which is somewhere, but this is very, probably just sound. Recording. Properties on my microphone. Oh, well that's not good. It's at 100. It was already at 100. Well, I could just physically bring my mic a little bit closer. I'll be having to move my keyboard a little bit anyway, so I need to make room for this very giant book that I have. Let's take a look. I know I haven't changed my microphone levels ever since our last stream, but the difference there is that I did purposefully talk quietly. Well, let's push this out of the way. Bring you a little bit closer. If you can hear my voice, then all is well. Let's see here. Oh, well, there is a gain dial back here. This is probably a very weird experience. Let's turn this up a little bit. And by that I mean like a full almost 90 degrees. Now you let me know if that made any difference. So, let's set the mood. You can't see this, sadly, but I am going to turn on my desk lamp just a little bit dimly and turn the color to a nice warm orange, like we're at a campfire. Yes, it did. A lot louder. Cool. Yes, I currently have background ambience to try and make things a little bit more immersive. But if I do completely overpower the ambience, maybe I might want to dial this back a teensy tiny bit. Just a little bit. Not by much. So, that being said, you can't see this, but what I have in my hand is a very large book spanning, let's take a look, 1,102 pages. The Complete Fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. There is a lot of stories in here. I didn't even, well, let's start from the beginning. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little story. I first got this book when I was stranded in the Philippines in 2019. And I was not having the best time of my life, but I did find at some point a mall. We went to the mall and there was a bookstore there. And I was like, wow, I've been wanting to get this Lovecraft book for a while. I sure hope that I find it. And I kid you not, I took only 2 steps into that bookstore. I saw this very book sitting on one of the first shelves, and I immediately grabbed it without a second thought and ran straight for the counter, and I bought it. This book, and many of its weird tales within, kept me sane during that exile in Southeast Asia. Whenever we had free time, which was a lot, I would read the passages in this book, and honestly, I got pretty far in. I don't remember exactly where I left off. I have not touched the book ever since that dreadful era of time. But I did not actually get to any of the main stories. I never got to the Call of Cthulhu. I never got to the Dunwich Horror at the Mountains of Madness, etc. Those are like the big shot stories, and I assume those are much later on. I want to say that I might have gotten around halfway through the book, but I could be very wrong. Oops, sorry. I'm trying to find the words here. I became immersed in so many different stories that, well, I kind of forgot most of their names. I only remember 3, maybe 4 of them. Obviously, the first one, the first story in the entire book, had a very memorable title for me. Humans tend to easily remember the beginning and end of a list. Impy says, Lovecraft story reading while I slay knights trying to summon an eldritch monster. Nothing more fitting, of course. Now, what do we have here? It's very funny when my keyboard is pushed all the way up. Well, I think what we're going to do is read through these stories from the beginning, and maybe if I have a bookmark somewhere, I don't think I do. Well, yes, I do. We can perhaps over the course of I don't know how many years, read through all of these one by one. For the time being, I don't think that my setup is the most ideal, but I am happy with what I have so far. So, I think we can make do. Perhaps over time we might be able to gain a higher production value. I am probably just dreaming right now, but sometimes I believe that the first step to making your dreams come true is to wake up. And that is something that I am doing currently. We are working in the waking world, just trying to make progress. I mean, aren't we all? I don't really know where that tangent came from. Well, I'm gonna open this right up. Why not? We're gonna skip the beginning, the introduction to this book, because it's really just... Geez, that is a lot of stories in this book. What? That's kind of a lot. I mean, okay. That's cool. Now then. There is an introduction here that mostly just explains the life of Mr. Lovecraft, but I think we can get to the interesting stuff. So, let's take a look here. The first story is called The Beast in the Cave. And so it's a little bit easier to keep track, I am actually going to edit some text on the screen, which should be appearing any moment now. Oh yeah, I'm sure you can see that loud and clear. I also chose the JMH Cthulhumbus font for this one, and I can't fathom why. Okay. Well, you're here now, in this random swamp of ours, and we are going to share some stories, so let us begin. If you see, by the way, if you of course hear any random background noise, that is either the random monsters of the swamp roaring out into the distance, or it could just be my family being loud. Archie, what do you mean? What do you mean my background looks off? I think it looked great. It is working as intended. If you're one, well, actually, I'll hold my judgment. I would like to know what you think is off about it. I know the cropping is definitely fine. To the right. There is like an image. Okay. Well, Well, arc_princess, allow me to send you a thing that I drew last night very quickly so that you can get a full picture of what is going on. Yes, Impy is right. Impy has a lot of perception. Oh, my bad. Hehe. Yes, I drew a background of the inside of a wooden shack with the world and the swamp falling apart ever so slightly just beyond the window. Well, it looks good to someone. Well, that's what's important. Yes. I had to frame that just right so that you can see the important details out the window. But don't stare at the moon too much. I don't think it's going to be good for your health. So, focus on the book in front of us, and today we are going to read The Beast in the Cave. Let us begin. I thought it was meant to be a swamp background. I noticed the wall textures. Yeah, it's meant to be both. Meant to be both. The Beast in the Cave. The horrible conclusion, which had been gradually obtruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind, was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast and labyrinthine recesses of the Mammoth Cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize on any object capable of serving as a guidepost to set me on the outward path. That furthermore, should I behold the blessed light of day, or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside, my reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed. Yet, indoctrinated as I was by a life of philosophical study, I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanor. For although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown the victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood quiet as soon as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. Nor did the thought that I had probably wandered beyond the utmost limits of an ordinary search cause me to abandon my composure, even for a moment. If I must die, I reflected, then this was terrible. Then was this terrible yet majestic cavern as welcome a sepulture as as that which any churchyard might afford. A conception which carried with it more of tranquility than of despair. Starving would prove my ultimate fate. Of this I was certain. Some, I knew, had gone mad under the circumstances such as these. But I felt that this end would not be mine. My disaster was the result of no fault save my own, since unbeknown to the guide I had separated myself from the regular party of sightseers, and, wandering for over an hour in forbidden avenues of the cave, I had found myself unable to retrace the devious windings which I had pursued since forsaking my companions. Already my torch had begun to expire. Hello, dog. Soon I would be enveloped by the total and almost palpable blackness of the bowels of the earth. As I stood in the waning, unsteady light, I idly wondered over the exact circumstances of my coming end. I remembered the accounts which I had heard of the colony of consumptives, who, taking their residence in this gigantic grotto to find health from the apparently salubrious air of the underground world, with its steady, uniform temperature, pure air, and peaceful quiet, had found instead death in strange and ghastly form. I had seen the sad remains of their ill-made cottages as I passed by them with the party, and had wondered with unnatural influence a long sojourn in this immense and silent cavern would exert upon one as healthy and as vigorous as I. Now, I grimly told myself, my opportunity for settling this point had arrived, provided that want of food should not bring me too speedy a departure from this life. As the last fitful rays of my torch faded into obscurity, I resolved to leave no stone unturned, no possible means of escape neglected. So, summoning all the powers possessed by my lungs, I set up a series of loud shoutings, in the vain hope of attracting the attention of the guide by my clamor. Yet, as I called, I believed in my heart my cries were to no purpose, and that my voice, magnified and reflected by the numberless ramparts of the black maze about me, fell upon no ears save my own. All at once, however, my attention was fixed upon... Where was I? My attention was fixed with a start, as I fancied that I heard the sound of soft approaching steps on the rocky floor of the cavern. Was my deliverance about to be accomplished so soon? Had then all my horrible apprehensions been for naught? And was the guide, having marked my unwarranted absence from the party, following my course and seeking me out in this limestone labyrinth? Whilst these joyful quest... I lost myself again. While these joyful queries arose in my brain, I was on the point of renewing my cries in order that my discovery might come the sooner, when in an instant my delight turned to horror as I listened, for my ever-acute ear, now sharpened in even greater degree by the complete silence of the cave, bore to my benumbered understanding the unexpected and dreadful knowledge that these footfalls were not like those of any mortal man. In the unearthly stillness of this subterranean region, the tread of the booted guide would have sounded like a series of sharp and incisive blows. These impacts were soft and stealthy, as of the padded paws of some feline. Besides, at times, when I listened carefully, I seemed to trace the falls of 4 instead of 2 feet. I was now convinced that I had, by my cries, aroused and attracted some wild beast, perhaps a mountain lion which had accidentally strayed within the cave. Perhaps, I considered, the Almighty had chosen me a swifter and more merciful death than that of hunger. Yet the instincts of self-preservation, never wholly dormant, was stirred in my chest, and though escape from the oncoming peril might but spare me for a sterner and more lingering end, I determined, nevertheless, to part with my life at as high a price as I could command. Strange as it may seem, my mind conceived of no intent on the part of the visitor save that of hostility. Accordingly, I became very quiet, in the hope that the unknown beast would, in the absence of a guiding sound, lose its direction, as had I, and thus pass me by. But this hope was not destined for realization, for the strange footfalls steadily advanced, the animal evidently having obtained my scent, which an atmosphere so absolutely free from all distracting influences as is that of the cave, could doubtless be followed at great distance. Seeing, therefore, that I must be armed for defense against an uncanny and unseen attack in the dark, I grouped about me the largest of the fragments of rock which were strewn about all parts of the floor of the cavern in the vicinity, and, grasping one in each hand for immediate use, awaited, with resignation, the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the hideous pattering of the paws drew near. Certainly, the conduct of the creature was exceedingly strange. Most of the time, the tread seemed to be that of a quadruped, walking with a singular lack of unison betwixt hind and 4 feet. Yet at brief and infrequent intervals I fancied that but 2 feet were engaged in the process of locomotion. I wondered what species of animal was to confront me. It must, I thought, be some unfortunate beast who had paid for its curiosity to investigate one of the entrances of the fearful grotto with a lifelong confinement in its interminable recesses. It doubtless obtained as food the eyeless fish, bats, and rats of the cave, as well as some of the ordinary fish that were wafted in at every freshet of green river, which communicates in some occult manner with the waters of the cave. I occupied my terrible vigil with grotesque conjectures of what what alterations cave life might have wrought in the physical structure of the beast, remembering the awful appearances ascribed by local tradition to the consumptives who had died after long residence in the cavern. Then I remembered with a start that, even should I succeed in killing my antagonist, I should never behold its form, as my torch had long been extinct, and I was entirely unprovided with matches. The tension on my brain now became frightful. My disordered fancy conjured up hideous and fearsome shapes from the sinister darkness that surrounded me, and that actually seemed to press upon my body. Nearer, nearer, the dreadful footfalls approached. It seemed that I must give vent to a piercing scream, yet I had been sufficiently irresolute to attempt such a thing. My voice could scarce have responded. I was petrified, rooted to the spot. I doubted if my right arm would allow me to hurl its missile at the oncoming thing when the crucial moment should arrive. Now the steady pat-pat of the steps was close at hand. Now, very close. I could hear the labored breathing of the animal, and terror-struck as I was, I realized it must have come from a considerable distance, and was correspondingly fatigued. Suddenly, the spell broke. My right hand, guided by my ever-trusty sense of hearing, threw with full force the sharp-angled bit of limestone which it contained, toward that point in the darkness from which emanated the breathing and pattering, and, wonderful to relate, it nearly reached its goal, for I heard the thing jump, landing at a distance away, where it seemed to pause. Having readjusted my aim, I discharged my second missile, this time most effectively. For with a flood of joy I listened as the creature fell in what sounded like a complete collapse, and evidently remained prone and unmoving. Almost overpowered by the great relief which rushed over me, I reeled back against the wall. The breathing continued, in heavy, gasping inhalations and expirations, whence I realized I had no more than wounded the creature, and now all desire to examine the thing ceased. At last, something allied to groundless, superstitious fear had entered my brain, and I did not approach the body, nor did I continue to cast stones at it in order to complete the extinction of its life. Instead, I ran at full speed in what was, as nearly as I could estimate, in my frenzied condition, the direction from which I had come. Suddenly I heard a sound, or rather a regular succession of sounds. In another instant they had resolved themselves into a series of sharp metallic clicks. This time there was no doubt. It was the guide. And then I shouted, yelled, screamed, even shrieked with joy, as I beheld in the vaulted arches above the faint and glimmering effulgence which I knew to be the reflected light of an approaching torch. I ran to meet the flare, and before I could completely understand what had occurred, I was lying upon the ground at the feet of the guide, embracing his boots, and gibbering, despite my boasted resolve, in a most meaningless and idiotic manner, pouring out my terrible story, and at the same time overwhelming my auditor with protestations of gratitude. At length, I awoke to something like my normal consciousness. The guide had noted my absence upon the arrival of the party at the entrance of the cave, and had, from his own intuitive sense of direction, proceeded to make a thorough canvass of the by-passages just ahead, where he had last spoken to me, locating my whereabouts after a quest of about 4 hours. By the time he had related this to me, I, emboldened by his torch and his company, began to reflect upon the strange beast which I had wounded but a short distance back in the darkness, and suggested that we ascertain, by the rushlight's aid, what manner of creature was my victim. Accordingly, I retraced my steps, this time with a courage born of companionship, to the scene of my terrible experience. Soon we descried a white object upon the floor, an object even whiter even than the gleaming limestone itself. Cautiously advancing, we gave vent to a stimulus. I lost myself. Of wonderment for all of the unnatural monsters either of us had in our lifetimes beheld. This was in surpassing degree the strangest. It appeared to be an anthropoid ape of large proportions, escaped perhaps from some eternant menagerie? I don't know that word. That's new. Its hair was snow white, a thing due to no doubt the bleaching action of a long existence within the inky confines of the cave. But it was also surprisingly thin, being indeed largely absent, save on the head, where it was of such length and abundance that it fell over the shoulders in considerable profusion. The face was turned away from us, as the creature lay almost directly upon it. The inclination of the limbs was very singular, explaining, however, the alternation in their use which I had before noted, whereby the beast sometimes used all four, and on other occasions but two, for its progress. From the tips of the fingers or toes, long, nail-like claws extended. The hands or feet were not prehensile, a fact I had ascribed to that long residence in the cave, which, as I before mentioned, seemed evident from the all-pervading and almost unearthly whiteness, so characteristic of the whole anatomy. No tail seemed to be present. The respiration had now grown very feeble, and the guide had drawn his pistol with the evident intent of dispatching the creature, when a sudden sound emitted by the latter caused the weapon to fall unused. The sound was of a nature difficult to describe. It was not like the normal note of any known species of simian, and I wondered if this unnatural quality were not the result of a long-continued and complete silence, broken by the sensations produced by the advent of the light, a thing which the beast could not have seen since its first entrance into the cave. The sound, which I might feebly attempt to classify as a kind of deep-toned chattering, was faintly continued. All at once, a fleeting spasm of energy seemed to pass through the frame of the beast. The paws went through a convulsive motion, and the limbs retracted. With a jerk, the white body rolled over so that its face was turned in our direction. For a moment I was so struck with horror at the eyes thus revealed that I noted nothing else. They were black. With horror... No, I missed that line. They were black. Those eyes, deep, jetty black, in hideous contrast to the snow-white hair and flesh. Like those of other cave denizens, they were deeply sunken into their orbits, and were entirely destitute of iris. As I looked more closely, I saw that they were set in a face less prognathous, I don't know that word, than that of the average ape, and infinitely more hairy. The nose was quite distinct. We gazed upon the uncanny sight presented to our vision. The thick lips opened, and several sounds issued from them, after which the thing relaxed in death. The guide clutched my coat sleeve and trembled so violently that the light shook fitfully, casting weird, moving shadows on the walls about us. I made no motion, but stood rigidly still, my horrified eyes fixed upon the floor ahead. Then fear left, and wonder, awe, compassion, and reverence succeeded in its place. For the sounds uttered by this stricken figure that lay stretched out on the limestone had told us the awesome truth. The creature I had killed, the strange beast of the unfathomed cave, was, or had some time been, a man. And that is the beast in the cave. Subscribe for more. Ugh. I need a water break. I believe it went down the wrong pipe. Ugh. Good story. Thank you, Bogus. Don't choke on the water. Okay. I will not choke on the water. Alright. Let's refresh my windpipe and my water pipe. I don't normally do readings like this. This is a very new experience for me, but I think there's some fun to be had, honestly. I think I'm okay now. You know, I think for a first Lovecraft story, I think The Beast in the Cave is a pretty good introduction, and I think it was a good idea to put it at the very start of this book. It's short. This was only about barely 6 pages. And yet, it already describes the writing style that this man had. It was very... How do I describe? It was very deep in its descriptions. Its wording was definitely distinct, to say the least. There was no real dialogue shared, and yet you could still you can still picture these scenes in your mind. And of course, there is a little bit of that fear and terror that he is so well known for writing. Or was well known, I guess. And of course, a very crazy, indistinct figure of some creature, which turns out, as always, the real monster is mankind itself. Or something like that. So that being said, let me take a look at the next story in this book. Well, this one is about as long, maybe a page or two longer. It is called The Alchemist. So let me go and edit that right now. I like alchemy, personally. Okay. Let's go for another one. Let's begin The Alchemist. One more sip. High up, crowning the grassy summit of a swelling mound whose sides are wooded near the base with the gnarled trees of the primeval forest, stands the old chateau of my ancestors. For centuries, its lofty battlements have frowned down upon the wild and rugged countryside about, serving as a home and stronghold for the proud house whose honored line is older even than the moss-grown castle walls. These ancient turrets, stained by the storms of generations and crumbling under the slow yet mighty pressure of time, formed in the ages of feudalism and one of the most dreaded and formidable fortresses in all France. From its... oh my gosh, what is that word? I'm just gonna wing it. From its machicolated parapets and mounted battlements, barons, counts, and even kings had been defied, yet never had its spacious halls resounded to the footsteps of the invader. But since these glorious years all is changed, a poverty but little above the level of dire want, together with a pride of name that forbids its alleviation by the pursuits of commercial life, have prevented the scions of our line from maintaining their estates in pristine splendor, and the falling stones of walls, the overgrown vegetations in the parks, the dry and dusty moat, the ill-paved courtyards, and toppling towers without, as well as the sagging floors, the worm-eaten wainscots, and the faded tapestries within, all tell a gloomy tale of fallen grandeur. As the ages passed, first one, then another of the four great turrets were left to ruin, until at last but a single tower housed the sadly reduced descendants of the once mighty lords of the estate, or estate, depending on how you pronounce it. It was in one of the vast and gloomy chambers of this remaining tower that I, Antoine, last of the unhappy and accursed Comte de... That word is actually cut off. It's not actually spelled out here. Very interesting. First saw the light of day 90 long years ago. Within these walls, and amongst the dark and shadowy forests, the wild ravines and grottos of the hillside below, were spent the first years of my troubled life. My parents I never knew. My father had been killed at the age of 32, a month before I was born, by the fall of stone somehow dislodged from one of the deserted parapets of the castle. And my mother having died at my birth, my care and education devolved solely upon one remaining servitor, an old and trusted man of considerable intelligence, whose name I remember as Pierre. I was an only child, and the lack of companionship which this fact entailed upon me was augmented by the strange care exercised by my aged guardian in excluding me from the society of the peasant children whose abodes were scattered here and there upon the plains that surrounded the base of the hill. At the time, Pierre said that his restriction was imposed upon me because my noble birth placed me above association with such plebeian company. Now I know that its real object was to keep from my ears the idle tales of the dread curse upon our line that were nightly told and magnified by the simple tenantry as they conversed in hushed accents in the glow of their cottage hearths. Thus isolated and thrown upon my own resources, I spent the hours of my childhood in poring over the ancient tomes that filled the shadow-haunted library of the chateau, and in roaming without aim or purpose through the perpetual dusk of the spectral wood that closed the side of the hill near its foot. It was, perhaps, an effect of such surroundings that my mind early acquired a shade of melancholy. Those studies and pursuits which partake of the dark and occult in nature almost strongly claimed my attention. Of my own race I was permitted to learn singularly little, yet what small knowledge of it I was able to gain seemed to depress me much. Perhaps it was at first only a manifest reluctance of my old preceptor to discuss with me my paternal ancestry that gave rise to the terror which I ever felt as the mention of my great house. Yet I grew out of childhood. As I grew out of childhood, I was able to piece together disconnected fragments of discourse let slip from the unwilling tongue which had begun to falter in approaching senility, that had a sort of relation to a certain circumstance which I had always deemed strange, but which now became dimly terrible. The circumstance to which I allude is the early age at which all of the comtes, I'm not French, but I'm going to pronounce them as combs. All the combs of my line had met their end. Whilst I had hitherto considered this but a natural attribute of a family of short-lived men, I afterward pondered long upon these premature deaths and began to connect them with the wanderings of the old man, who often spoke of a curse which for centuries had prevented the lives of beholders of my title from much exceeding the span of 32 years. Upon my 21st birthday, the aged Pierre gave to me a family document which he had said for many generations had been handed down from father to son, and continued by each possessor. Its contents were of the most startling nature, and its perusal confirmed the gravest of my apprehensions. At this time my belief in the supernatural was firm and deep-seated, else I should have dismissed with scorn an incredible narrative unfolded before my eyes. The paper carried me back to the days of the 13th century, when the old castle in which I had sat had been a feared and impregnable fortress. It told of a certain ancient man who had once dwelt on our estates, a person of no small accomplishments, though little above the rank of peasant. By name, Michel, usually designated by the surname of Malvi, the Evil, on account of his sinister reputation. He had studied beyond the custom of his kind, seeking such things as the philosopher's stone or the elixir of eternal life, and was reputed wise in the terrible secrets of black magic and alchemy. Michel Malvi had one son named Charles, a youth as proficient as himself in the hidden arts, and who had therefore been called Le Sorcier, or the Wizard. This pair, shunned by all honest folk, were suspended of the most hideous practices. Old Michel was said to have burnt his wife alive as a sacrifice to the devil, and the unaccountable disappearances of many small peasant children were laid at the dreaded door of these two. Yet, through the dark natures of the father and the son, ran one redeeming ray of humanity. The evil old man loved his offspring, with fierce intensity, whilst the youth had for his parent a more than filial affection. One night, the castle on the hill was thrown into the wildest confusion by the vanishment of a young Godfrey, son to Henry the Combe. A searching party, headed by the frantic father, invaded the cottage of the sorcerers, and there came upon old Michael Mavier, busy over a huge and violently boiling cauldron. Without certain cause, in the ungoverned madness of fury and despair, the combe laid hands on the aged wizard, and ere he released his murderous hold, his victim was no more. While joyful servants were proclaiming the finding of young Godfrey in a distant and unused chamber of the great edifice, telling too late that poor Michel had been killed in vain. As the combe and his associates turned away from the lowly abode of the alchemists, the form of Charles Le Sorcier appeared through the trees. The excited chatter of the menials standing about told him what had occurred, yet he seemed at first unmoved at his father's fate. Then, slowly advancing to meet the combe, he pronounced, in dull yet terrible accents, the curse that ever afterwards haunted the house of C. The word is crossed out again. Very interesting. May ne'er a noble of thy murderous line survive to reach a greater age than thine. What did Impy say? That is a funky word. That does make sense. Spake he, when suddenly, leaping towards into the black wood, he drew from his tunic a phial of colorless liquid, which he threw into the face of his father's slayer, as he disappeared behind the inky curtain of the night. The combe died without utterance, and was buried the next day, but little more than 32 years from the hour of his birth. No trace of the assassin could be found, though relentless bands of peasants scoured the neighboring woods and the meadowland around the hill. Thus time and the want of a reminder dulled the memory of the curse in the minds of the late Combs family, so that when Godfrey, innocent cause of the whole tragedy, and now bearing the title, was killed by an arrow whilst hunting at the age of 32, there were no thoughts save those of grief at his demise. But when, years afterward, the next young combe, Robert by name, was found dead in a nearby field from no apparent cause, the peasants told in whispers that their seigneur had but lately passed his 32nd birthday, when surprised by early death. Louis, son to Robert, was found drowned in the moat at the same fateful age, and thus, down through the centuries, ran the ominous chronicle. Henrys, Roberts, Antoines, and Armands, snatched from happy and virtuous lives, when little below the age of their unfortunate ancestor at his murder. That I had left at most but 11 years of further existence was made certain to me by the words which I read. My life, previously held at small value, now became dearer to me each day, as I delved deeper and deeper into the mysteries of the hidden world of black magic. Isolated as I was, modern science had produced no impression upon me, and I labored as in the Middle Ages, as rapt as had been old Michel and young Charles themselves in the acquisition of demonological, that's quite a word, and alchemical learning. Yet, read as I might, in no manner could I account for the strange curse upon my line. In unusually rational moments, I would even go so far as to seek a natural explanation, attributing the early deaths of my ancestors to the sinister Charles Le Sorcier and his heirs, Yet, having found upon careful inquiry that there were no known descendants of the alchemist, I would fall back to occult studies, and once more endeavor to find a spell that could release my house from its terrible burden. Upon one thing I was absolutely resolved. I should never wed, for since no other branches of my family were in existence, I might thus end the curse with myself. As I drew near the age of 30, old Pierre was called to the land beyond. Alone I buried him beneath the stones of the courtyard, about which he had loved to wander in life. Thus I was left to ponder to myself, as the only human creature within the great fortress, and to my utter solitude my mind began to cease its vain protest against the impending doom, to become the most reconciled to the fate which so many of my ancestors had met. Much of my time was now occupied in the exploration of the ruined and abandoned halls and towers of the old chateau, which in youth fear had caused me to shun, and some of which, old Pierre had once told me, had not been trodden by human foot for over 4 centuries. Strange and awesome were many of the objects I encountered. Furniture covered by the dust of ages and crumbling with the rot of long dampness met my eyes. Cobwebs in a profusion never before seen by me were spun everywhere. Huge bats flapped their bony and uncanny wings on all sides of the otherwise untenanted gloom. Of my exact age, even down to days and hours, I kept a most careful record. For each movement of the pendulum of the massive clock in the library told off so much more of my doomed existence. At length I approached that time which I had so long viewed with apprehension, since most of my ancestors had been seized some little while before they reached the exact age of Combe Henry. At his end, I was every moment on the watch for the coming of the unknown death. In what strange form the curse should overtake me, I knew not. But I was resolved, at least, that it should not find me a cowardly or a passive victim. With new vigor I applied myself to my examination of the old chateau and its contents. It was upon one of the longest of all my excursions of discovery in the deserted portion of the castle, less than a week before that fatal hour which I felt must mark the utmost limit of my stay on earth, beyond which I could have not even the slightest hope of continuing to draw breath, that I came upon a wait, I lost the line. The culminating event of my whole life. I had spent the better part of the morning in climbing up and down half-ruined staircases in one of the most dilapidated of the ancient turrets. As the afternoon progressed, I sought the lower levels, descending into what appeared to be either a medieval place of confinement or a more recently excavated storehouse for gunpowder. As I slowly traversed the niter-encrusted passageway at the foot of the last staircase, the paving became very damp, and soon I saw, by the light of my flickering torch, that a blank, water-stained wall impeded my journey. And my ambience has just ran out, so let's repeat it. Lol. Turning to retrace my steps, my eye fell upon a small trap door with a ring, which lay directly beneath my feet. Pausing, I succeeded with difficulty in raising it, whereupon there was revealed a black aperture, exhaling noxious fumes which had caused my torch to sputter, and disclosing in the unsteady glare the top of a flight of stone steps. As soon as the torch, which I lowered into the repellent depths, burned freely and steadily, I commenced my descent. The steps were many, and led to a narrow, stone-flagged passage which I knew must be far underground. The passage proved of great length and terminated in a massive oaken door, dripping with the moisture of the place and stoutly resisting all my attempts to open it. Ceasing after a time my efforts in this direction, I had proceeded back some distance toward the steps, and there suddenly fell to my experience one of the most profound and maddening shocks capable of reception by the human mind. Without warning, I heard the heavy door behind me creak slowly open upon its rusted hinges. My immediate sensations are incapable of analysis. To be confronted in a place as thoroughly deserted as I had deemed the old castle, with evidence of the presence of man or spirit, produced in my brain a horror of the most acute description. When at last I turned and faced the seat of the sound, my eyes must have started from their orbits at the sight that they beheld. There, in the ancient Gothic doorway, stood a human figure. It was that of a man clad in a skull cap and long medieval tunic of dark color. His long hair and flowing beard were of a terrible and intense black hue, and of incredible profusion. His forehead high beyond the usual dimensions, his cheeks deep sunken and heavily lined with wrinkles, and his hands, long, claw-like and gnarled, were of such a deathly, marble-like whiteness as I had never elsewhere seen in man. His figure, lean to the proportions of a skeleton, was strangely bent and almost lost within the voluminous folds of his peculiar garment. But strangest of all were his eyes, twin caves of abysmal blackness, profound in expression of understanding, yet inhuman in degree of wickedness. These were now fixed upon me, piercing my soul with their hatred, and rooting me to the spot whereon I stood. At last, the figure spoke in a rumbling voice that chilled me through its dull hollowness and latent malevolence. The language in which the discourse was clothed was that debased form of Latin in use amongst the more learned men of the Middle Ages, and made familiar to me by my prolonged researches into the works of the old alchemists and demonologists. The apparition spoke of the curse which had hovered over my house, told me of my coming end, dwelt on the wrong perpetrated by my ancestor against old Michel Mauvais, and gloated over the revenge of Charles Le Sorcier. He told how the young Charles had escaped into the night, returning in after years to kill Godfrey the heir with an arrow just as he approached the age which had been his father's at his assassination. How he had secretly returned to the estate and established himself unknown in the even then deserted subterranean chamber, whose doorway now framed the hideous narrator. How he had seized Robert, son of Godfrey, in a field, forced poison down his throat, and left him to die at the age of 32, thus maintaining the foul provisions of his vengeful curse. At this point I was left to imagine the solution of the greatest mystery of all, how the curse had been fulfilled that time when Charles Le Sorcier must, in the course of nature, have died. For the man digressed into an account of the deep alchemical studies of two wizards, father and son, speaking most particularly of the searches of Charles Le Sorcier, concerning the elixir which should grant him who partook of it eternal life and youth. His enthusiasm had seemed for the moment to remove from his terrible eyes the hatred that had at first so haunted them. But suddenly the fiendish glare returned, and with a shocking sound like the hissing of a serpent, the stranger raised a glass phial with the evident intent of ending my life, as had Charles Le Sorcier 600 years before ended that of my ancestor. Prompted by some preserving instinct of self-defense, I broke through the spell that had hitherto held me immovable, and flung my now dying torch at the creature who menaced my existence. I heard the phial break, harmlessly, against the stones of the passage, as the tunic of the strange man caught fire and lit the horrid scene with a ghastly radiance. The shriek of fright and impotent malice emitted by the would-be assassin proved too much for my already shaken nerves, and I fell prone upon the slimy floor in a total faint. When at last my senses returned, all was frightfully dark, and my mind, remembering what had occurred, shrank from the idea of beholding more. Yet curiosity overmastered all. Who, I asked myself, was this man of evil? And how came he within the castle walls? Why should he seek to avenge the death of poor Michel Mauvais? And how had the curse been carried on through all the long centuries since the time of Charles Le Sorcier? The dread of years was lifted from my shoulders, for I knew that he whom I had felled was the source of all my danger from the curse. Now that I was free, I burned from the desire to learn more of the sinister thing which had haunted my line for centuries, and made of my own youth one long-continued nightmare. Determined upon further exploration, I felt in my pockets for flint and steel, and lit the unused torch I had with me. First of all, the new light revealed the distorted and blackened form of the mysterious stranger. The hideous eyes were now closed. Disliking the sight, I turned away and entered the chamber beyond the Gothic door. Here I found what seemed much like an alchemist's laboratory. In one corner was an immense pile of shining yellow metal that sparkled gorgeously in the light of the torch. It may have been gold, but I did not pause to examine it, for I was strangely affected by that which I had undergone. At the farther end of the apartment was an opening, leading out into one of the many wild ravines of the dark hillside forest. Filled with wonder, yet now realizing how the man had obtained access to the chateau, I proceeded to return. I had intended to pass by the remains of the stranger with averted face, but as I approached the body, I seemed to hear, emanating from it, a faint sound, as though life were not yet wholly extinct. Aghast, I turned to examine the charred and shriveled figure on the floor. Then all at once, the horrible eyes, blacker even than the seared face in which they were set, opened wide with an expression which I was unable to interpret. The cracked lips tried to frame words which I could not well understand. Once I caught the name of Charles Le Sorcier, and again I fancied that the words years and curse issued from the twisted mouth. Yet I was at a loss to gather the purport of his disconnected speech. At my evident ignorance of his meaning, the pitchy eyes once more flashed malevolently at me, until, helpless as I saw my opponent to be, I trembled as I watched him. Suddenly the wretch, animated with his last burst of strength, raised his hideous head from the damp and sunken pavement. Then, as I remained paralyzed with fear, he found his voice, and in his dying breath screamed forth those words which have ever afterward haunted my days and my nights. "Fool," he shrieked, "can you not guess my secret? Have you no brain whereby you may recognize the will which has through 6 long centuries fulfilled the dreadful curse upon your house? Have I not told you of the great elixir of eternal life? Know you not how the secret of alchemy was solved? I tell you, it is I, that have lived for 600 years to maintain my revenge, for I am Charles Le Saucier. And that's the Alchemist. That is a very, very butthurt alchemist. Huh, says Impy. I pulled out my copy of the complete works of H.P. Lovecraft, and The Beast and Alchemist are 5 and 6 in the short stories collection, sorted in chronological order. First is The Little Glass Bottle. I don't think I read The Little Glass Bottle. I have a different book here, Impy. The complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. The title has, or the cover has a lot of tentacles coming out of it, which is cool. I guess maybe it's not as organized as yours, or maybe it's just organized differently. But either way, that's pretty cool. I'm so glad that you have that book. I think, in my opinion, that is quite based. It's a shame H.P. Lovecraft died so young. We never got to see him truly mastering his style of writing. Yeah. Yeah, it was a terrible way to go. He became very hungry, I believe, and eventually would eventually fall to cancer, I think. I'm sure he had a lot to think about on that deathbed. I think it's kind of interesting. I like the setting of a large, what's the word? A large, like, derelict castle. Imagine being so huge that your hallways do not even get explored for several hundred years. And imagine living all alone like that. That would be quite the existence. You got nothing to yourself except for all of the libraries and the books in your house. That's interesting. Maybe I could, like, go for a couple days on such a vacation, but I do eventually want to have some sort of companionship. I can't believe Charles was so mad. I mean, I guess it's understandable, but he sure did figure things out. I don't know how he did it without being caught. Well, until now, anyway. Let's take a look at the next story. I want to see how many pages there are. A little bit of a long one. It goes from pages 15 to 24. So it's like 9 pages, a couple pages longer than The Beast in the Cave. That makes me wonder, how long is the story after that? That's not very long at all, actually. 25, 27, 29. 4 pages. Interesting. Well, okay. Let's see. Let's see how far my voice can take me. The next story is called The Tomb, which I'm sure is definitely not going to be foreboding whatsoever. But the story after that is Dagon, or Dagon. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but I think that's intentional. Water break. Okay. Well, I guess I'm training my voice a little bit. Let's go ahead and change our little subtitle over here. That too. The story begins with what appears to be a Latin sentence, which I do not understand nor can probably pronounce, apparently quoted by a man named Virgil. So it's very cool that Devil May Cry actually shows up in a Lovecraft story. I think that's really cool. Guy probably really enjoyed that game growing up. Makes sense. And then after the Latin quote, there is the rest of the story. So let's give it a run through. In relating the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt of the authenticity of my narrative. I had to go, I'm back now. Hi, Envy. It is an unfortunate fact that the bulk of humanity is too limited in its mental vision to weigh with patience and intelligence those isolated phenomena, seen and felt only by a psychologically sensitive few, which lie outside its common experience. Men of broader intellect know that there is no sharp distinction betwixt the real and the unreal. That all things appear as they do only by virtue of the delicate individual, physical and mental media through which are made conscious of them. But a prosaic materialism of the majority condemns this madness, the flashes of supersight which penetrate the common veil of obvious empiricism. Empiricism? That's a new word. My name is Jervis Dudley, and from earliest childhood I had been a dreamer and a visionary, wealthy beyond the necessity of a commercial life, and temperamentally unfitted for the formal studies and social recreations of my acquaintances. I have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world, spending my youth and adolescence in ancient and little-known books, and in roaming the fields and groves of the region near my ancestral home. I do not think what I read in these books or saw on these fields and groves was exactly what other boys read and saw there. But of this I must say little, since detailed speech would but confirm those cruel slanders upon my intellect which I sometimes overhear from the whispers of these stealthy attendants around me. It is sufficient for me to relate events without analyzing causes. Wow, imagine playing Final Fantasy. Well, as long as you have fun. Next page. I have said that I dwelt apart from the visible world, but I have not said that I dwelt alone. This is no human creature may do. For, lacking the fellowship of the living, he inevitably draws upon the companionship of things that are not, or are no longer, living. Close by my home there lies a singular, wooded hollow. In those twilight deeps I spend most of my time, reading, thinking, and dreaming. Down its moss-covered slopes my first steps of infancy were taken. Around its grotesquely gnarled oak trees my first fancies of boyhood were woven. Well did I come to know the presiding dryads of those trees, and often I watched their wild dances in the struggling beams of a waning moon. But of those things I must not now speak. I will tell only of the lone tomb in the darkest of the hillside thickets. The deserted tomb of the Hydes, lol, Hydes? An old and exalted family whose last direct descendants had been laid within its black recesses many decades before my birth. The vault to which I refer is of ancient granite, weathered and discolored by the mists and dampness of generations. Excavated back into the hillside, the structure is visible only at the entrance. The door, a ponderous and forbidding slab of stone, hangs upon rusted iron hinges, and is fastened ajar in a sinister way by means of heavy iron chains and padlocks, according to a gruesome fashion of half a century ago. The abode of the race whose scions are here, Inurned had once crowned the, what is that word? Declivity which holds the tomb, but had since long fallen victim to the flames which sprang up from a disastrous stroke of lightning. Of the midnight storm which destroyed this gloomy mansion, the older inhabitants of the region sometimes speak in hushed and uneasy voices, alluding to what they call divine wrath, in a manner that years later vaguely increased the always strong fascination which I felt for the forest-darkened sepulchre. One man had perished in the fire. When the last of the Hydes was buried in this place of shade and stillness, the sad urnful of ashes had come from a distant land, to which the family had repaired when the mansion burned down. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite portal, and few care to brave the depressing shadows which seem to linger strangely about the water-worn stones. I shall never forget the afternoon when first I stumbled upon the half-hidden house of death. It was in midsummer, when the alchemy of nature transmutes the sylvan landscape to one vivid and almost homogeneous mass of green, when the senses are well high intoxicated with the surging sea of moist verdure, and the and the subtly indefinable odors of the soil and the vegetation. In such surroundings, the mind loses its perspective. Time and space become trivial and unreal, and echoes of a forgotten prehistoric past beat insistently upon the enthralled consciousness. All day I had been wandering through the mystic groves of the hollow, thinking thoughts I need not discuss, and conversing with things I need not name. In years, a child of 10, I had seen and heard many wonders unknown to the throng. It was oddly aged in certain respects, when, upon forcing my way between two savage clumps of briars, I suddenly encountered the entrance of the vault. I had no knowledge of what I had discovered. The dark blocks of granite, the door so curiously ajar, and the funeral carvings above the arch aroused in me no associations of mournful or terrible character. Of graves and tombs I knew and imagined much, but had on account of my peculiar temperament been kept from all personal contact with churchyards and cemeteries. The strange stone house on the woodland slope was to me only a source of interest and speculation, and its cold, damp interior, into which I vainly peered through the aperture so tantalizingly left, contained for me no hint of death or decay. But in that instant of curiosity was born the madly unreasoning desire which has brought me to this heck of confinement. Spurred on by a voice which must have come from a hideous soul of the forest, I resolved to enter the beckoning gloom in spite of the ponderous chains which barred my passage. In the waning light of day, I alternately rattled the rusty impediments with a view to throwing wide the stone door, and essayed to squeeze my slight form through the space already provided. but neither plan met with success. At first curious, I was now frantic, and when, in the thickening twilight, I returned to my home, I had sworn to the 100 gods of the grove that at any cost I would someday force an entrance into the black chilly depths that seemed calling out to me. The physician with the iron-gray beard who comes each day to my room once told a visitor that this decision marks the beginning of a pitiful monomania. But I will leave final judgment to my readers when they shall have learnt all. The months following my discovery were spent in futile attempts to force the complicated padlock of the slightly open vault, and in carefully guarded inquiries regarding the nature and history of the structure. With the traditionally receptive ears of the small boy, I learned much, though an habitual secretiveness caused me to tell no one of my information or my resolve. It is perhaps worth mentioning that I was not at all surprised or terrified on learning of the nature of the vault. My rather original ideas regarding life and death had caused me to associate the cold clay with the breathing body in a vague fashion, and I felt that the great and sinister family of the burned-down mansion was in some way represented within the stone space I sought to explore. I hate time zones. Anyway, I'm here now. Hi, Sugs. Mumbled tales of the weird rites and godless revels of bygone years in the ancient hall gave to me a new and potent interest in the tomb, before whose door I would sit for hours at a time each day. Once I thrust a candle within the nearly closed entrance, but I could see nothing save a flight of damp stone steps leading downward. The odor of the place repelled yet bewitched me. I felt I had known it before, in a past remote beyond all recollection, beyond even my tenacity of the body I now possess. The year after I first beheld the tomb, I stumbled upon a worm-eaten translation of Plutarch's Lives into the book-filled attic of my home. Reading the life of Theseus, I was much impressed by that passage, telling of the great stone beneath which the boyish hero was to find his tokens of destiny whenever he should become old enough to lift its enormous weight. This legend had the effect of dispelling my keenest impatience to enter the vault, for it made me feel that the time was not yet ripe. Later, I told myself, I should grow to a strength and ingenuity which might enable me to unfasten the heavily chained door with ease, but until then, I would do better by conforming to what seemed the will of fate. Accordingly, my watches by the dark, dank portal became less persistent, and much of my time was spent in other, though equally strange pursuits. I would sometimes rise very quietly in the night, stealing out to walk in those churchyards and places of burial from which I had been kept by my parents. What I did there I may not say, for I am now sure that the reality of certain things, but I know that on the day after such a nocturnal ramble I would often astonish those about me with my knowledge of topics almost forgotten for many generations. It was after a night like this that I shocked the community with a conceit about the burial of the rich and celebrated Squire Brewster, a maker of local history who was interred in 1711, and whose slate headstone, bearing a graven skull and crossbones, was slowly crumbling to powder. In a moment of childish imagination, I vowed not only that the undertaker, Goodman Simpson, had stolen the silver-buckled shoes, silken hose, and satin small clothes of the deceased before burial, but that the squire himself, not fully inanimate, had turned twice in his mound-covered coffin on the day after interment. But the idea of entering the tomb never left my thoughts, being indeed stimulated by the unexpected genealogical discovery that my own maternal ancestry possessed at least a slight link with the supposedly extinct family of the Hydes. Last of my paternal race, I was likewise the last of this older and more mysterious line. I began to feel that the tomb was mine, and to look forward with hot eagerness to the time when I might pass within that stone door, down those slimy stone steps in the dark. I now formed the habit of listening very intently at the slightly open portal, choosing my favorite hours of midnight stillness for the odd vigil. By the time I came of age, I had made a small clearing in the thicket before the mold-stained facade of the hillside, allowing the surrounding vegetation to encircle the overhang the space like the walls and roof of a sylvan bower. Bower, perhaps? This bower was my temple, the fastened door my shrine, and here I would lie outstretched to the mossy ground, thinking strange thoughts and dreaming strange dreams. The night of the first revelation was a sultry one. I must have fallen asleep from fatigue, for it was with a distinct sense of awakening that I heard the voices. Of those tones and accents I hesitate to speak. Of their quality I will not speak. But I may say that they presented certain uncanny differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and mode of utterance. Every shade of New England dialect, from the uncouth, syllables of the Puritan colonists to the precise rhetoric of 50 years ago, seemed represented in that shadowy colloquy. Colloquy? That's a word. Though it was only later that I noticed the fact. At the time, indeed, my attention was distracted from this matter by another phenomenon. A phenomenon so fleeting I could not take oath upon its reality. I barely fancied as I awoke a light had been hurriedly extinguished from within the sunken sepulchre. Greatly and permanently... Sorry, I skipped a line. I do not think I was either astounded or panic-stricken, but I know that I was greatly and permanently changed that night. Upon returning home, I went with such directness to a rotting chest in the attic, wherein I found the key, which the next day unlocked with ease the barrier I had so long stormed in vain. It was in the soft glow of late afternoon that I first entered the vault on the abandoned slope. A spell was upon me, and my heart leaped with an exultation I can but ill describe. As I closed the door behind me and descended the dripping steps by the light of my lone candle, I seemed to know the way. And through the candle sputtered with the stifling reek of the place, I felt singularly at home in the musty, charnel house air. Looking about me, I beheld many marble slabs bearing coffins, or the remains of coffins. Some of these were sealed and intact, others had nearly vanished, leaving the silver handles and plates isolated amidst certain curious heaps of whitish dust. Upon one plate I read the name of Sir Geoffrey Hyde, who had come from Sussex in 1640 and died here a few years later. In a conspicuous alcove was one fairly well-preserved and untenanted casket, adorned with a single name which brought to me both a smile and a shudder. An odd impulse caused me to climb upon the broad slab, extinguish my candle, and lie down within the vacant box. In the grey light of dawn, I staggered from the vault and locked the chain of the door behind me. I was no longer a young man, though but 21 winters had chilled my bodily frame. Early-rising villagers who observed my homeward progress looked at me strangely and marveled at the signs of ribald revelry which they saw in one whose life was known to be sober and solitary. I did not appear before my parents till after a long and refreshing sleep. Henceforthward I haunted the tomb each night, seeing, hearing, and doing things I must never reveal. My speech, always susceptible to environmental influences, was the first thing to succumb to the change, and my suddenly acquired archaism of direction was soon remarked upon. Later, a boldness and recklessness came into my demeanor, until I unconsciously grew to possess the bearing of a man in the world despite my lifelong seclusion. My formerly silent tongue waxed voluble with easy grace of a Chesterfield or the godless cynicism of a Rochester. Rochester? I displayed a peculiar erudition utterly unlike the fantastic, monkish lore over which I had pored in youth, and covered the fly-leaves of my books with facile impromptu epigrams which brought up successions of prior and the sprightliest, that's a name, of the Augustan wits and rhymesters. One morning at breakfast I came close to disaster by declaiming in palpably licorice accents and effusion of 18th century Bachelanian mirth, a bit of Georgian playfulness never recorded in a book, which ran something like this. Come hither, my lads, with your tankards of ale, and drink to the present before it shall fail. Pile each on your platter a mountain of beef, for 'tis eating and drinking that brings us relief. So fill up your glass, for life will soon pass. For when you're dead, you'll never drink to your king or your lass. Anacreon had a red nose, so they say. But when's a red nose if you're happy and gad split me, I'd rather be red whilst I'm here than white as a lily and dead half a year. So Betty, my miss, come give me a kiss. In heck, there's no innkeeper's daughter like this. Young Harry, propped up as straight as he's able, will soon lose his wig and slip under the table. But fill up your goblets and pass 'em around. Better under the table than under the ground. So revel and chaff, as ye thirstily quaff. Under 6 feet of dirt, 'tis less easy to laugh. The fiends strike me blue. I'm scarce able to walk, and darn me if I can stand upright or talk. Here, landlord, bid Betty to summon a chair. I'll try home for a while, for my wife is not there, so lend me a hand. I'm not able to stand. Whilst I linger on top of the land. One heck of a poem. About this time, I conceived my present fear of fire and thunderstorms. Previously indifferent to such things, I had now an unspeakable horror of them, and would retire to the innermost recesses of the house whenever the heavens threatened an electrical display. A favorite haunt of mine during the day was the ruined cellar of the mansion that had burned down, and in fancy I would picture the structure as it had been in its prime. On one occasion I startled a villager by leading him confidently into a shallow sub-cellar, of whose existence I seemed to know in spite of the fact it had been unseen and forgotten for many generations. At last came that which I had long feared. My parents, alarmed at the altered manner and appearance of their only son, commenced to exert over my movements a kindly espionage which threatened to result in disaster. I had told no one of my visits to the tomb, having guarded my secret purpose with religious zeal since childhood, but now I was forced to exercise care in threading the mazes of the wooded hollow, that I might throw off a possible pursuer. My key to the vault I kept suspended from a cord around my neck, its presence known only to me. I never carried out of the sepulchre any of the things I came upon whilst within its walls. One morning, as I emerged from the damp tomb and fastened the chain of the portal with none too steady hand, I beheld an adjacent thicket the dreadful face of a watcher. Surely the end was near, for my bower was discovered, and the objective of my nocturnal journeys revealed. The man did not accost me, so I had hastened home in an effort to overhear what he might report to my careworn father. Were my sojourns beyond the chained door about to be proclaimed to the world? Imagine my delighted astonishment on hearing the spy inform my parents in a cautious whisper that I had spent the night in the bower outside the tomb. My sleep-filmed eyes fixed upon the crevice where the padlocked portal stood ajar. By what miracle had the watcher been thus deluded? I was now convinced that a supernatural agency protected me. Made bold by this heaven-sent circumstance, I began to resume perfect openness in going to the vault, confident that no one could witness my entrance. For a week I tasted to the full the joys that charnel, that is a word, conviviality, which I must not describe. Then the thing happened. I was borne away to this accursed abode of sorrow and monotony. I should not have ventured out that night, for the taint of thunder was in the clouds, and the heckish phosphorescence rose from the rank swamp at the bottom of the hollow. The call of the dead, too, was different. Instead of the hillside tomb, it was the charred cellar on the crest of the slope whose presiding daemon beckoned to me with unseen fingers. As I emerged from an intervening grove upon the plain before the ruin, I beheld in the misty moonlight a thing I had always vaguely expected. The mansion, gone for a century, once more reared its stately height to the raptured vision, every window ablaze with the splendor of many candles. Up the long drive rolled the coaches of the Boston gentry, whilst on foot came a numerous assemblage of powdered exquisites from the neighboring mansions. With this throng I mingled, though I knew belonged with the hosts rather than with the guests. Inside the hall were music, laughter, and wine on every hand. Several faces I recognized, though I should have known them better had they been shriveled or eaten away by death and decomposition. Amidst a wild and reckless throng, I was the wildest and most abandoned. Blasphemy poured in torrents from my lips, and in my shocking sallies I heeded no law of God, man, or nature. Suddenly a peal of thunder, resonant even above the din of the swindish revelry, clave the very roof and laid a hush of fear upon the boisterous company. Red tongues of flame and searing gusts of heat engulfed the house, and the roisterers, struck with terror at the descent of a calamity which had seemed to transcend the bounds of unguided nature, fled shrieking into the night. I alone remained, riveted to my seat by a groveling fear which I had never felt before. And then a second horror took possession of my soul. Burnt alive to the ashes, my body dispersed by the four winds, I might never lie in the tomb of hides. Was not my coffin prepared for me? Had I not a right to rest till eternity amongst the descendants of Sir Geoffrey Hyde? I would claim my heritage of death, even though my soul go seeking through the ages for another corporeal tenement to represent it on the vacant slab on the alcove of the vault. Jervis Hyde should never share the sad fate of Palinurus. As the phantom of the burning house faded, I find myself screaming and struggling madly in the arms of two men, one of whom was the spy who had followed me to the tomb. Rain was pouring down in torrents, and upon the southern horizon were flashes of lightning that had so lately passed over our heads. My father, his face lined with sorrow, stood by as I shouted my demands to be laid within the tomb, frequently admonishing my captors to treat me as gently as they could. A blackened circle on the floor of the ruined cellar told of a violent stroke from the heavens, and from this spot a group of curious villagers with lanterns were prying a small box of antique workmanship, which the thunderbolt had brought to light. Ceasing my futile and now objectless writhing, I watched the spectators as they viewed the treasure trove and was permitted to share in their discoveries. The box, whose fastenings were broken by the stroke which had unearthed it, contained many papers and objects of value. But I had eyes for one thing alone. It was the porcelain miniature of a young man in a smartly curled bagwig, and bore the initials J.H., the face of such that as I gazed, I might well have been studying my mirror. On the following day, I was brought to this room with the barred windows. But I have been kept informed of certain things through an aged and simple-minded servitor, for whom I bore a fondness in infancy, and who, like me, loves the churchyard. What I have dared relate in my experiences within the vaults has brought me only pitying smiles. My father, who visits me frequently, declares that at no time did I pass the chained portal, and swears that the rusted padlock had not been touched for 50 years when he examined it. He even says that all the village knew of my journeys to the tomb, and that I was often watched as I slept in the bower outside the grim facade, my half-open eyes fixed on the crevice that leads to the interior. Against these assertions I have no tangible proof to offer, since my key to the padlock was lost in the struggle on that night of horrors. The strange things of the past which I had learned during those nocturnal meetings with the dead he dismisses as fruits of my lifelong and omnivorous browsing amongst the ancient volumes of the family library. Had it not been for my old servant Hiram, I should have, by this time, become quite convinced of my madness. But Hiram, loyal to the last, has held faith in me, and has done that which impels me to make public that at least part of my story. A week ago, he burst open the lock which chains the door to the tomb perpetually ajar, and descended with a lantern into the murky depths. On a slab in an alcove, he found an old but empty coffin, whose tarnished plate bears the single word, Jervis. In that coffin, and in that vault, they have promised me I shall be buried. And that was the tomb. And it sounds like my guy here is going mad. And that tends to be a running gag in every single Lovecraft story, for the most part. There's one story I remember that makes literally no sense and nothing happens at all. But we'll probably get to that some other time. Water break. What do we got over here? Dude, I can't sleep right now. So I had this on hold. You are a savior. Thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting. I kind of forgot about this story. This is one of the ones that I had forgotten about when I had first read this book in the Philippines. But something I was expecting another story that I was vaguely remembering, but I guess we're not going to get to that until later. Well, my friend just sent me 60 days of Final Fantasy subscription even though I told them not to. Dang. Unfortunately, Impy, it seems that you are going to have to rebirth the realm over and over. That game's been going on for like a solid 10 years. I'm kind of impressed. Probably more. But hey, maybe you'll be able to clear out the all of the campaigns at this point. So, the next story is called Dagon. And it's going to be the shortest story so far, and I think that's okay. I do believe it'll be the shortest story in our little session today, and probably the last one for now. I can't say that I particularly mind. A short story. Okay, that's about 4 pages. The story after that is also 4 pages, but we'll save that for next time. Let's go ahead and read Dagon. Yeah, 10 years, but scratch 1 or 2 or 1x, which was so bad they killed the game to start over. Dang. That sure is something. Let's edit the text. Dagon, my man, who is the main playable character in a nice little RTS called Sea Salt, which I might actually stream at some point. That would be interesting. Now, he's going to be the first of the actual Eldritch horrors that we read in this series of stories. We don't actually meet that many other big names until later. I read I think the Azathoth and or Nyarlathotep stories, but I didn't quite understand them. There wasn't really much to them, but maybe if we ever get to a second reading, I might be able to make sense of it. But for now, I will go right on ahead and read Dagon. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer. Shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. I do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship
or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon heaving vastness of the unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awakened, I was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of heckish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder and at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid, with carcasses of decaying fish, and other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any sea fowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade to the sun, as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness, and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight and evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day I traveled towards the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance. An intervening valley, setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill.
Yes, Mum. It's just an image.
I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down to the other side, to an immeasurable pit, or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim to a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Though through my terror ran curious reminiscence of paradise lost and Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easily footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the greater slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps, where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude, and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship living and thinking creatures. Worship of living and thinking creatures, I should add. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of a scientist or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out the sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of unconventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did the most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs, whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dore. I think that those things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage to some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for their mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were darnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other featureless and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background. For one of the creatures was shewn in the act of killing a whale, represented as but a little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor, the Piltdown or Neanderthal man, was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into the past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing, while the moon cast reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, which it had flung its gigantic scaly arms, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard pearls of thunder, and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I seem it unnecessary, nor did I seem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated anthologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon, perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account of the information for the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. I often ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likeness on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink, and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door. Some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. Gosh, that hand. The window. The window. And that was Dagon. Knock, knock, it's Dagon at your door. Yes, you're right. That was most definitely a Portal 2 reference. It had to have been. You do not understand, Ryu, and yet to gaze into the eldritch and lose thy mind, says Impy. Yes, I believe that makes perfect sense. Water time. Okay. We are now on page 30. The next story, at least what would be the next story, is called A Reminiscence of Dr. Samuel Johnson. And I think this is the story that is like a complete resident sleeper. Like, this makes no freaking sense whatsoever. But I think that's okay. We had quite a couple stories to go through. We learned about the beast in the cave. We learned about the elixir of eternal life from the Alchemist. We learned about the tomb and this guy that went insane just thinking about being buried underground somewhere. And finally, the tales of a man who saw John Dagon himself and the rise of the fish people. And the mere thought of it and the mere presence of Dagon at his door, delusion or not, pushed him over the edge of his window. Rest in peace. That was fun. I think for a small little test run, I think that was pretty well. I don't need to push myself too hard, you know? If we're gonna go through this book, we can just take it in bites. And there are some stories that are so indescribably long that we would be here for a long time. So that for now is the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. I'm sorry for the rumbling noises. I do actually have a bookmark, so allow me to go and grab that. I'm kidding. I have a sheet of bookmarks, but literally none of them are cut, so I would have to do that myself. I will probably deal with that right after this is over. So, you know, I hope you have had some amount of entertainment listening to me tonight. I am now going to edit the text, or rather, yeah, there we go. I'll just hide it. I think it's time to call it a night. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's story time. I do unfortunately have to go to work tomorrow, but I had fun, and I hope you did as well. I think Dagon is a good note to leave it off on. Let's see here. Yeah, there we are. Okay. I need to relax my voice after all that. I hope you have at least, to some degree, found this entertaining, and if so, we will do this again someday. Clap, clap. Well, thank you, my friend. I will wish you all a good rest of your night, and thank you for celebrating Valentine's Day with me. It's been a real pleasure. Sleep well, my friends.